Today is December 8th, 2022, and it's the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, so I hope that you enjoyed a happy feast day. We certainly did here. And this afternoon, I was discussing a topic on social media with friends, and I mentioned that many of the controversial issues that we see emerging today have been in development for hundreds of years, even thousands of years. And in 2022, we're seeing a lot of these ancient ideas, ancient desires of man come to their fulfillment or reach their end, as it were. And as we look at what's going on, you can see these things in the news, and I'm not one of these, end times prophets as people try to be, because anyone who understands what prophecy is understands that the fulfillment of prophecies are impossible to understand until they actually are fulfilled, and therefore it's a waste of time trying to figure out if prophecies are being fulfilled when our actual responsibility is to obey the commandments so that no matter what happens, whether they're fulfilled or not in our time, we enjoy the blessings that God promises and avoid the penalties that he threatens us with. But if we look in the news and in current events, we see a lot of really amazing things. Several of the most amazing things center around Elon Musk, of course. And I saw that Taylor Marshall just posted a video to discuss whether Elon Musk is the Antichrist, which is, ridiculous. But, that's the kind of thing that we think of when we see someone tapping into these new areas of intelligence and communication and transportation, and it's just more interesting when one individual happens to have his finger upon the front lines of these major developments. If you're not familiar with what Elon Musk is doing, one of the things obviously is SpaceX, where he is developing the technology to allow for space travel in a way that it could never be done before, because rockets can actually re-enter the Earth's orbit and land and possibly be reused. So that's a major development. He's also recently purchased Twitter, which gives him direct control of one of the 2 or 3 most powerful communication platforms that exist today. And he's working on making changes to that are going to radically affect our society. And then, in addition to that, he's developing internet and providing internet access through his, what is it called, Starlink program. And then, of course, he's got this whole transportation revolution under his control, where he's developing electric vehicles with Tesla. So all of these things going on, being directed by him as a scientist, as an inventor, as an activist, as a business executive, and so on. And if we look at what he's actually working on, another thing, before I forget, another thing is Neuralink. If you haven't heard about Neuralink, it's actually the attempt to insert computer chips or devices into the brain to actually influence human behavior. And he promises things like, problems like paralysis and other physical injuries can possibly be overcome through the assistance of this Neuralink technology. Wild stuff, interesting stuff. And these 3 or 4 different things all revolve around really around one person and the businesses that he's created. But as we look around, there's just so much uncertainty and oddness. I'm sure that you look at the White House and wonder to yourself, how in the world could this be the government of the United States of America? How in the world could this be the president? I watched this press speaker, this woman who's like an African American lesbian woman, and she's just like a trained dummy to read off these papers, and it's so embarrassing and painful to watch, and all of the fake public statements of the congressmen and women and so on just leaves you wondering, what in the world is going on? We look at this war in Ukraine, we look at all of the chaos in Europe, and then we've got China and all their chaos over there in the Far East, and there's just so much strange activity in the news. It's really impossible to make any sense out of any of it. I almost refuse to pay much attention to it because it's just craziness. There's no way to make any sense out of it. And I think, my conclusion at least is that it's just not profitable for me or anyone else to spend much time on it. And so I turn your attention away from those things, and it's Advent season, and we're getting ready for Christmas. And this morning, my wife woke me up, and the first thing we talked about was getting started with Christmas shopping for the kids. And we're talking about what we're going to do. And my wife's pitching some ideas about what she thinks that we should do, and I've got some ideas about what I think we should do. And then we ended up talking, and the conversation got around to video games. And I was telling my wife that, it's what's going on with video games is really very interesting. One thing that's clear is that kids and even adults really love video games, really love them. I mean, can play them all day long. And I know that the sort of automatic Christian reaction is to condemn it all and say it's stupid and useless and a waste of time. And when I was a kid, all that normal reactionary talk. But the problem is that reaction is really not true. And it may make a person feel good to talk like that, but the reality is the things we say to the kids about video games, responding to that, reacting to that, most of them aren't even true. For example, most of us don't actually live the life that we tell our children that they should live. Most of us, if we're given the alternative between doing something manually and making use of technology to do it, we choose to use technology to do it. You're sitting here watching a video right now. I'm sitting here making a video right now. Most of us don't choose to take the manual method when a technological or mechanical method is available. I use the highest levels of technology I can in my businesses. Most of my work is done sitting at a desk working with a computer. That's how work is done today. That's how intellectual work is done. And so that initial lazy automatic reaction to the video games to tell the kids how stupid it is, how you should be doing this and that and this, and you should be doing this instead, if we actually step back and listen to ourselves, we'll realize that much of what we're saying isn't even true in the modern world. So, for example, I live on a farm out in rural North Carolina, and I can go out and work in the garden, and in our family here we've got equipment to use. We've got tillers and tractors and all kinds of different equipment. And to tell you the truth, I like to go out to the garden with just a shovel and a hoe and do a lot of the work manually. I like to do it that way. I do it for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is because it's good physical exercise. And so while I'm actually taking care of a task like turning over garden bed or hoeing weeds in a row of plants, I'm also getting some physical exercise out of it, and it's good for me. I can stick headphones in my ears and listen to an audiobook while I turn over the soil or hoe the weeds. I like to do that. I like to do the garden work and much of the farm work in a simple, manual way, but I don't like to do it because it's more productive to do it that way or because I hope that it will be more fruitful. It's because I have other interests. I'd like to also use the time to listen to an audiobook, things like that. I have other things that I'd like to accomplish at the same time. It's not for the sake of the farm work or for productivity or anything like. It's because I'd like to have peace and quiet. I'd like to not have a tiller running or engines turning or the tractor, screaming in the garden or anything like that. I'd like to have it quiet. I'd like to be able to listen to a book and, put in an hour, 2 hours of garden work and also do something intellectual or spiritually edifying at the same time. So that's what motivates me to do that, because otherwise it's pretty stupid. If you've got the tiller, it's pretty stupid to go out there with a hoe and basically do the work of a tiller manually. But there's more to the work than just turning over the soil or clearing the weeds. There's more to it than that. There's other things that I'm concerned with, and that's why I do it the way that I do it. If I told my son, hey, will you go out and hoe those 3 rows for me today, I wouldn't expect my son to go out and do it the way that I do it, because his interest is just to get that chore done and help me out, whereas that's actually not why I go out to the garden. But I don't expect him to go out with my motivation and my interests and my methods. I expect him to go grab the tiller, run it up and down the rows, and be done with it. And that's helpful. So these methods and manners that we talk about, there's usually other things motivating us to be interested in those things. We have other concerns, and that's why we like a certain culture, a certain method, a certain way of doing things. It's not because we think it's better to do them that way. It's not because it is better to do them that way. It's because there are other things that we're concerned about. So when we talk to the kids, their desire to make use of technology is reasonable. It makes perfect sense why they'd be interested in that. And like I said, much of our criticism of the video game culture is either hypocritical or it's simply untrue. For example, my older kids are in the military. They join the military, and there's a certain level of physical fitness that's necessary for military service and activity. And so they go through basic training, and they go through their training. They've got to do their physical training every week, every month, tests throughout the year, and so on, because there's a certain level of physical fitness that's necessary for military service. That's all true. You have to pick up a physical gun and be able to fire rounds at a physical target and hit the target. There's real world physical stuff that needs to be done. They have to get a 35 or 40 pound sack on their back and ruck 12 miles in order to complete some of their school fitness tests and things like that. There's a lot of physical work to do, but the military provides that training. And that's really it. Much of the actual work they do, for example, my kids are ROTC cadets, and so they're studying. That's part of their military service at this point in their life. They have to study, and they're working on computers, sitting at desks, doing their studies, making use of technology. So criticizing the technology and saying, what do you think you're going to do? Go use computers? And actually, you are going to go use computers, even in the military. While they're at their military training and things like that, they have virtual reality shooting ranges that they go to for training. So what do you think? You think it's going to be virtual activities if you join? Well, actually it is. Yeah, it is. If you look at what's going on in Ukraine this week, there are Ukrainians using drones to bomb air bases 600 or 700 miles into Russian territory. And these drones are basically controlled like video games. There are people on computers using either GPS coordinates or lasers to mark targets, and there are people controlling these unmanned drones from remote locations and blowing up strategic targets. So what are we going to tell the kids? That this video game joystick activity is not real life? It actually is real life. It actually is how things are done. Drones are going to be more and more important in modern military activity because they save human lives, and they're much cheaper to use than human beings. And so it's going to become more and more like video game activity in modern warfare. And so these arguments against the kids aren't even true. And this is one of the problems I see. And so we get into these discussions about video games, and it's very interesting, I think. Because like I said, I have very physical, very active, very tough sons. They exercise, they're fit, they're either in the military or planning to enter the military. They check all the boxes. They're active, fit, strong, masculine, they're patriotic, on and on. They check all the boxes, and yet they love video games. And that's why I sort of roll my eyes when I hear these people criticizing them, saying, oh, they're going to make you this, and they're going to... That's not true. Many of the professional athletes in our society and college athletes spend all of their free time playing video games. It has nothing to do with being weak or effeminate or anything else. Those two things are not directly related. There are other factors that contribute to those undesirable qualities. What interests me about the video games is that they allow us to satisfy a desire for a certain mental experience. There's a certain mental exhilaration, emotional exhilaration that we experience through video games, which is very similar to the mental or emotional experience that we have when we participate in activities, in the flesh, as it were. For example, I grew up playing sports, and I grew up in a family that owned race cars and was heavily into auto racing. I can sit with my son and play a sprint car racing game and have almost as much enjoyment in that game as I used to have at the actual races. The same mental experience can be had in the game, except it's tens of thousands of dollars cheaper to play the video game and have that same pleasant mental experience than it is to actually attend the races or actually work on and maintain a race car to race for that thrill of competition. You can have that experience without all the costs, without any of the danger, any of the waste. You don't have to pay for fuel and tires and all of these crazy things. You can have the enjoyment of the challenge and contest of racing on a video game, and it's very gratifying without any of the costs or negatives. The same thing is true with sports games. You can play a basketball game, for example, on PlayStation, and you can enjoy the mental exhilaration of having to move and pass and shoot and aim at a target and hit a target and all these things. All of these things that make actually playing basketball enjoyable, you can do them in the video game. That's why even athletes enjoy the video games. You don't have to physically train, you don't have to physically jump, you don't have to physically run, you don't have to deal with any injuries and so on. You can enjoy the mental exhilaration of the contest without any of the physical burdens of that contest. The same is true with military games, like Call of Duty, which my sons enjoy playing. You can get into Call of Duty and enjoy thinking about combat. You can enjoy learning about weapons and tactics, and you can compete with and against other people. And you can enjoy this thrill of the hunt, as it were, the actual challenge of trying to seek out and stop an enemy while also saving your own life. And, the video game, if you do lose your life, you can start over again and go right back at it and continue to enjoy that experience. And my kids, my older sons tell me that, it's actually really helpful. The things that they learn in training and in all their different schools and things like that, they actually are found in these games, and it's very realistic. So my point that I want to talk about, what I think is interesting, that video games and the obsession with video games, because they're so gratifying, is that this reveals something about us. It reveals something about what we seek in life. It's not necessarily auto racing that we seek. It's not necessarily playing basketball or football or baseball or any other sport that we actually seek. It's not actually military activity that we seek. It's not actually, these different activities in the physical world that we're really interested in. It's the experience of them. It's the physical, or not the physical. It's the mental experience of these different contests and activities that really interests us in them. And this mental experience can largely be enjoyed through video games, especially as they get more realistic and more detailed, and more money and research and development goes into them. They get more and more gratifying. And we see that if you give kids an option, you can go outside and play wiffle ball together, or B, you can play baseball on the PlayStation, the kids will usually choose the PlayStation. And I'm talking again about athletic, physically fit, strong boys. I'm not talking about wimpy, effeminate, vampires living in the house all day long. They enjoy playing the game on the computer, maybe even more than playing the game outside in the yard or down the road at the basketball courts or whatever. And what it shows us is that the mental gratification is actually more important for us than the physical experience of these activities. And if you think about the fact that we're creatures made in the image of God, composed of body and soul, and that the soul is more important than the body is temporary and dies, it's actually revealing that such creatures would prefer a virtual reality experience where they have many of the desirable mental experiences, or exhilaration, arousal, and so on, then they really have interest in the physical activities. Humans, it makes sense for humans to be drawn to these mentally stimulating activities. And that's why I don't necessarily think that the criticism of human beings showing interest in video games is really reasonable. I think there's more to this whole situation than we're allowing. There's more being revealed here. There's more going on than Christians are willing to think about. They're just reacting, and they're not thinking and pondering these things and wondering what really is going on here. And if we look at modern society, this is where this discussion is going. If we look at modern society, we see that there is a real human pleasure, and then there are counterfeit human pleasures. There's a real human longing, a real human desire for spiritual, intellectual gratification and rest that we all are seeking. And then there's an endless number of counterfeits of that real human longing and gratification. And yet these counterfeits are signs that point to that real human longing. The video games are showing us that we would rather have something that's, quote unquote, spiritual than physical. We'd rather have something that's intellectual than something that's necessarily social or, again, material. We're very satisfied with an intellectual experience without any of the physical experience. We're content to give up the physical experience to enjoy the intellectual experience. We consider the intellectual experience more valuable, more desirable, more satisfying than the physical experience. And this is the danger of our lives. We're seeking spiritual rest in a physical world, and while we give a lot of attention to our bodies just because they're sensual and they're active, we can see in modern society that human beings would prefer to live an increasingly intellectual life. Human beings are working, whether they really think about it or not, they're working to create an increasingly intellectual world. They would rather have computers and live in suburbs than have horses and live on farms. Even though people talk about being interested in farm life, it's usually just, cute consumer talk. They don't actually practice these things, or they talk about it when they visit a farm, but they don't talk about it, on a January morning when it's sleeting outside and you've got to go feed the animals and milk the cows. They're talking about visiting a farm in October or in May, about how they would love to live on a farm. They're not baling hay in late June in the South, or, turning over heavy, wet soil in February in the Northeast. They're just talking about visiting a farm or imagining what farm life would be like at the most beautiful time of year. It's not realistic talk. And when they get out into the farm life, if you have the choice to have an intellectual life or a life, harvesting potatoes, there are very few human beings who are going to be satisfied digging up potatoes for a living. They're going to want more intellectual stimulation. And again, I know people will verbally disagree with that, but practically what I say will be found to be true. And again, I live in agricultural, rural North Carolina. I've done everything in farming, and I'm telling you that it's not satisfying to the human person to work in the dirt all day long. It's not gratifying. Our souls desire greater things, more sublime things. They desire God Himself. And while it may be gratifying to think about how nice it would be to escape from the stress of your present professional environment, that pleasure of the rustic life, that runs out quite quickly if you actually practice it. Again, not visiting a farm, not agritourism and all that nonsense. I'm talking about real farm life. It's extremely difficult work. Not so much because it's physical, but because it's constant. For example, If you own a dairy, as we did, you have to feed and milk the cows every single day, twice a day. And I said every single day, twice a day. The idea of coming into the house with a fresh pail of milk sounds fun, but you have to do it every single day, twice a day in reality. And that becomes very tedious and difficult. And if you don't have it arranged as a real business with employees and days off available for people and things like it's next to impossible to maintain as a business unless you're just going to collect, a gallon of milk for your own family. That's just hobby farming, though. So anyway, my point is that we can see in modern society that while we seem to criticize modern society and say, oh, it's just hedonism, it's just, indulgence of the flesh and its lusts and all of these things, and we talk about all these things. If we actually look, however, I don't think that that's really true. I think we're actually moving in the opposite direction. We're not moving towards God in any conscious kind of way, but we're moving from the physical to the intellectual. We're moving from the material to the virtual. And there's a general human desire to move in that direction. And we see that in video games, in computers, in mobile phones, and so on. We see a desire for a more intellectual, a more virtual reality. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I think it's a sign that we're sort of tired of the physical world and we're looking for something more perfectly human, more godlike. Now, as I said, I think that there is a reality that we're supposed to seek, and that reality, that spiritual reality that we desire is God himself. And we can almost say the virtual reality that we desire is heaven itself. It's the spiritual realm itself where we know, our souls know that heaven is our true home. And we have this longing in us that's in us by nature to return to this virtual reality that we have a vague sense exists, but we know not where or how to get there or what exactly this vague idea is that we're affected by. The reality is that our souls are longing to return to their Creator and to rest in God himself, and yet we don't understand that necessarily, especially unbelievers. We don't understand that as a race, and yet we find that we're still seeking something that is beyond the physical, something that is metaphysical or supernatural. And video games are, in a way, supernatural or virtual in comparison to the actual physical activities which they imitate, which gets us into a whole nother topic, the topic of imitation. So I find this interest in video games to be very revealing, and I think it's wrongly responded to by Christian people, hypocritically, falsely, and carelessly. And I think that there's more to it than this. So if we look at modern society and we look and we say that Elon Musk is creating electric cars, and we're trying to explore the idea of traveling beyond our own planet. And we look at this desire to, insert chips into the brain to lead men to some supernatural condition. And we look at all of these things. We look at artificial intelligence and ideas about how we can build for ourselves tools that enhance our natural abilities and allow us to go beyond what we're naturally capable of. We see all these developments, but this is what has been going on, and this is the important part. This is what has been going on all throughout human history. If we go all the way back to Socrates, for example, Socrates warned that books and writing are dangerous because there's a real wisdom, a wisdom that exists in our souls that we're to pursue, that will actually satisfy our desire to know and understand. Real wisdom which dwells in our soul. And it's only true wisdom if it dwells in our soul. And yet there are counterfeits of true wisdom which do not dwell in our soul. And he argued that writing and books were a counterfeit, a false kind of knowledge, and not true wisdom, true understanding that dwells in the soul. A man would write something and think that he knows it because he wrote it, or he would obtain a book and think that he possesses knowledge because he possesses a book, but the knowledge that's contained on the pages of the book doesn't actually dwell in his soul, and therefore it's not really understanding or scientific knowledge. And Socrates warned 400 years before Christ that writing and books were dangerous because they created a counterfeit idea of learning and wisdom that wasn't the real thing. Because true wisdom, like I said, exists in our soul. In the time of the scientific revolution, if we look at the writings of Francis Bacon, what is Francis Bacon actually arguing for? What is he actually saying? He's saying, he's actually not saying that we need to abandon reason and rely entirely on our senses. He's often oversimplified by that kind of a summary, that we should not rely on reasoning or on revelation or tradition or any kind of authority, but we should rely on our senses. And that's not what Francis Bacon actually taught. What Francis Bacon taught is that we should use reason to build instruments that enhance our senses. We should build telescopes. We should build microscopes. And we should use these instruments to enhance our senses. And it's this supernatural sense that we should rely on to learn about the world. And you can see that this supernatural sense is a counterfeit of the supernatural power we already possess in human reason. The ancient philosophers were already using the real supernatural tool or instrument that God created in us. They were already using that. It was already in use by the ancient wise men, by the prophets, by the wise men of ancient Israel. It was already being used by Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and Pythagoras and the other philosophers. It was united to faith as divine revelation was made through the centuries. God already was providing the real supernatural tools of learning in faith and reason. Francis Bacon was rejecting those real supernatural tools, not suggesting that we should rely on natural senses alone, but arguing that we should create artificial tools other than faith and reason, which should be used to enhance the senses, and that should be the basis of our knowledge of the world. It was this idea of instrumental, experimental science, making use of instruments that were developed by man to enhance the human senses. The space telescopes that we've currently got in space, they are simply, the fulfillment of Francis Bacon's plan to use human understanding and intelligence to develop tools to enhance our physical senses. And they are counterfeit instruments that replace faith and reason, which are the guides that God actually intended us to make use of. The reason why God equipped us with weak senses was because we're really not dependent on the senses for the pursuit of the most sublime truths that our souls long to understand. Faith and reason are the tools provided to the soul. Both of them exist in the soul, for the soul. And this modern scientific approach to knowledge is a counterfeit of the real supernatural approach to knowledge which God himself provides for us. And so what we see in modern technology with computers, with telescopes, with rockets, with microscopes, with artificial intelligence, all of this technology, we see this attempt to build a supernatural sensory experience that man will use to seek knowledge which he thinks that will bring him this state of mental rest. But it will never, ever happen because it's a counterfeit. And that's what we see. We see this move away from the real thing to this man-made counterfeit. And this is the same thing that we see in video games. It's the same thing we see in all of this technology, in modern science, in modern mathematics, on and on. These things have an appearance of advancing human life and leading to human happiness, but they're actually counterfeits of the real sources of this happiness that God has given us, which actually dwell in our soul, which is faith and reason, real wisdom, real understanding. This is how God intended for us to understand the world in which we live. This is how God intended for us to understand ourselves. Our senses are helpful to a degree, which is why they're not that important. They're important in certain things to a degree, but not beyond that. Our knowledge of God, for example, is not dependent on our senses. And this whole modern, fascination with technology and seeing farther and seeing smaller things and hearing things farther away and increasing our senses, constantly increasing the power of our senses, is just this vain idea that our senses are the real means to wisdom and happiness. And we're just working and investing to expand and improve our senses. And what happens is we just find that the universe gets more and more complex as we do so, and we're just back to the drawing board. The more we see, the less we see. The more we hear, the less we hear. The farther we travel, the less we've traveled. And that's the vanity of this counterfeit learning, which is everything that we see in modern society. And we see this is what we see in this video game culture, in all of this modern technology, modern music, all of this, electronic music, this computer-generated music, things like that. It's not true music. It's not the music that dwells in the soul. It's not this scientific pursuit of harmony and rest, intellectual rest, that is available in classical music, the art of classical music, not the period of classical music. But this is what we see. And I think that when we see our kids interested in video games, to play a video basketball game rather than physical basketball, to play a video military game instead of a real physical military activity, to play video this or virtual reality that, I think we see that this is the human soul seeking and reaching for satisfaction beyond physical things, but it's misguided. And I think that if we're smart as Christians, we can use this as an opportunity to explain this to our children, to explain why it is that they enjoy video games, why it is that they enjoy virtual reality or they enjoy this technology and things like that, why their human nature is attracted to this virtual world and this mental experience that these modern things give them. And these are signs showing us that there's something for which we're created that's beyond this physical realm. And I think if we're a little more thoughtful and careful, we can take advantage of this current set of circumstances in modern society and talk to people about how what we actually see are signs of our soul thirsting for gratification in these counterfeits. And these are signs that are showing us what our souls desire, and we're going to perpetually frustrate ourselves unless we learn from these signs and see what these signs are really pointing us to and direct our attention, direct our souls to that true source of satisfaction, which is God himself. And so I think we have to be careful how we deal with these things, because what Christians are telling kids is often the opposite. They're saying it would be much better for you to go do something physical than to do something intellectual. And you know, what's mom and dad even saying, really? It's we're not animals. It's not better to go, harness yourself to a plow and go pull a plow, go yoke yourself to the plow and drag it through the field and say, there, that's better. How is that? It's not even human activity. That's the work of oxen. What the children are doing is more human than plowing a field. And so this is a real interesting dilemma that I think is revealing to us a yearning in the souls of modern people. And it's an opportunity for us to thoughtfully and carefully direct them to their source of happiness and satisfaction, which is God himself. So I'd love to know your thoughts. I'm talking a lot about video games as an example, and my kids really don't mess too much with video games. They do, and I don't fuss about it because it's usually after they've completed their schoolwork or other work. Adult students visiting home, adult kids visiting home from college, things like that. So I don't fuss about it much, but I don't find it to be a real problem, and I think it actually raises some interesting meditations that we need to deal with. So I'd love to know your thoughts. I'd like to know what you've seen in your experience. I don't want to hear ignorant rambling, no prophetic doom and gloom, because it's just a bunch of baloney. Let's think through these things so that we can have intelligent responses and actually help our kids, rather than allow something like a video game to create a gulf between us and ruin our relationships, because we're just trying to react with the normal copy and paste nonsense that we hear from other people who themselves haven't thought about these things before they started reacting. So let me know what you think. God bless.